My father accidentally sent me the kind of video that erases any illusion about your place in your own family. I had just walked into my small townhouse in Boulder, Colorado, exhausted after a double shift at the clinic, when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A message from Dad, nothing unusual. Sometimes he sent old camping clips or grainy birthday videos, little reminders that even though I lived miles away, I was still tethered to them. Without thinking, I tapped the notification. The screen wobbled like the phone had been set against a stack of magazines. I saw the arm of my parents' sofa, the edge of the fireplace, and a cluster of shapes sitting close together. I couldn't see every face, but I didn't need to. I knew the voices instantly. The first thing I heard was my name, followed by laughter. Then came my father's voice, steady and casual in a way he never managed with me, saying I was a pathetic failure. Someone, probably my brother, snorted and added that I should feel lucky I was finally useful for something, because at least I was good for covering their bills. They weren't whispering, they weren't upset, they were comfortable, relaxed, laughing about the years I'd spent wiring money home, paying off their debts, covering emergencies that somehow became routine. And in their eyes, that made me pathetic. I stood there with my keys still in my hand, listening as they listed all the ways they could guilt me if I ever tried to stop. Then, just as my father leaned toward the camera, the video disappeared. "This message has been unsent." The chat thread went blank, as if none of it had ever existed. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I placed the phone face down on the counter and stared at the reflection of my own tired eyes in the dark window. In that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to beg for clarification. I wasn't going to demand apologies. I was going to wait because, in a few days, the next payment was due, and that was when everything would shift. By morning, the familiar pressure had already settled over me, the same weight I'd learned to ignore until the numbers on my calendar made it impossible. It was unsettling how quickly muscle memory returned dates, amounts, deadlines, like my brain had been conditioned to manage my family's chaos as if it were my job. And that pattern hadn't started because anyone ever asked gently. It had started because the need never stopped. Rent notices, overdue utilities, medical bills, sudden car repairs. Each one passed to me with the same quiet certainty that I would handle it. When I was younger, I believed stepping in was simply part of being the responsible one. Later, when I moved into my townhouse in Boulder and began my work at the clinic, the requests didn't fade, they expanded. New expenses appeared faster than my paychecks ever could. No matter how many late shifts I picked up, their emergencies always seemed to outrun my income. And as the next payment deadline crept closer, the shift in tone from my mother, Denise, arrived right on schedule. She never opened with the real reason she contacted me. There was always a warm greeting first, a softened entry meant to make the blow easier. But the warmth lasted only a sentence or two, before she eased into the true purpose. The reminders started gentle, then grew pointed, then sharpened into the same expectation I'd learned to feel in my bones. My dad, Paul, rarely added anything to these conversations, but his silence did nothing to lighten the pressure. It intensified it. His quiet meant he expected the problem solved without needing to voice it. I'd learned years ago that his approval lived somewhere between what I provided and how quickly I provided it. My younger brother, Mason, never bothered with subtlety. His messages came clipped, rushed, shaped by panic and entitlement. The world always seemed moments from collapsing unless I intervened. His urgency consistently arrived before even a hint of gratitude. And every notification hit harder now, not because their tone surprised me, but because I finally understood the truth behind it. I replayed that late-night video in my mind more times than I cared to admit. Not the insults themselves, but the ease behind them, the comfort, the confidence that I would always fall in line. Still, even after everything I'd heard, my instinct to solve everyone's problems rose almost automatically. My mind jumped to numbers, budget adjustments, solutions. It startled me how deeply the habit had rooted itself. My life had been arranged around their demands for so long that trying to separate my responsibilities from theirs felt like untangling a knot in my own chest. But the knot loosened the moment I allowed myself to acknowledge something I had never once considered. I couldn't keep doing this. Not financially, not emotionally, not while pretending their expectations came from love. That truth made the next step unmistakable. Not easy, but unmistakable. As the deadline approached, I typed a response that felt foreign beneath my fingertips. It was short, bare. Nothing like the soft explanations I'd spent years sending. There was no apology in what I typed, no justification, no promise to make things easier later. I wrote only what needed to be said, without softening the edges or cushioning the truth. Then I hit send. The moment after was quiet, not peaceful, but steady, like the air had shifted in my townhouse. I didn't know how they would react, and for once I didn't rehearse their arguments in my head. All I knew was that this was the first choice in years that belonged entirely to me, not to their expectations. Later that week, another notification appeared on my phone, but the weight of it felt different. It wasn't another reminder from my mom, or one of Mason's frantic messages. It was a voice note from my dad's sister, Valerie, someone who rarely contacted me directly unless she wanted to steer the narrative. Seeing her name confirmed the household had officially escalated things. I didn't press play right away. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the little blue waveform, knowing exactly what her involvement meant. Valerie had always mastered the art of combining sweetness with strategy. She resolved conflicts by redirecting them, controlling the emotional tone while acting as if she was simply mediating. In the end, her loyalties always aligned with whoever benefited most from my support. Her stepping in meant they had already discussed me, likely in the same living room where that video had been recorded. I had become uncooperative, unpredictable, inconvenient. Eventually, I pressed play. Her voice filled the room, immediately warm, melodic at first. She hoped I was doing well, she said. She'd heard there was some confusion about the upcoming expenses. Confusion. As if I'd misplaced my sense of duty, as if I'd forgotten the role they'd assigned me. Her tone was soft, intentional, wrapping guilt and concern. Then the warmth thinned. She shifted into practiced disappointment, her words sliding between empathy and accusation. She spoke about family history, about sacrifices made for me, stories reworked to highlight everything except the years I supported myself, worked through school, and built a life without any of their help. Then came the pivot, sharp enough to expose the real purpose. Families survived by leaning on each other, she said, and stepping away now would show everyone exactly what kind of person you're choosing to become. The implication was unmistakable. If I didn't return to my role, I was betraying them. According to her, love and loyalty were measured by endurance, specifically mine. The message ended with a warning disguised as compassion. Once a line like this was crossed, she said, it became very hard to return. She said resentment had a way of settling into people, and that forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. The tone suggested I was gambling with the family's future, not that they had been gambling with my trust for years. When the recording ended, the silence in my townhouse felt almost physical, stretching across the living room like a shadow I didn't invite. I let her final words settle not because they held truth, but because they revealed everything I had refused to acknowledge. Valerie hadn't reached out of love. She had reached out because they were afraid. Afraid of losing access to the version of me they had relied on for so long, the version who never questioned, never hesitated, never said no. I didn't replay the message. I didn't compose a polite response. I didn't analyze the emotional traps stitched into her tone. Instead, I tapped the screen once, muted the thread, and removed it from my view. It was the quietest refusal I had ever made, and it steadied me in a way I didn't expect. For the first time, the pressure from home didn't sink into my chest. It remained outside, distant, like a noise I could hear but didn't have to absorb. Their expectations had always existed in a world where my compliance was automatic. But now that I had finally said no, even silently, something inside me shifted. I knew this wouldn't be the last attempt they would try again. Boundaries rarely go untested. But whatever came next would meet a version of me they had never bothered to understand, a version who no longer flinched at distance. By the weekend, the tension in the air had a different shape. I felt it before I saw it, a strange hush in my apartment that made every small sound echo. I never imagined anyone would show up at my door. My family rarely traveled unless circumstances forced their hand. That's why the firm knocks startled me more than they should have. When I opened the door, my younger sister, Sierra, stood on the porch, drenched from Oregon's relentless rain, her expression sharpened with purpose. Seeing her tightened something in my chest, not fear, but recognition. Sierra never confronted anything directly unless she believed she held the advantage. She stepped inside without waiting, dripping rain across the hardwood as she entered the living room. The air around her felt charged, as if she'd carried the storm in with her. And as she looked around, taking in the quiet order of my home, I could see something unsettling flicker across her face: comparison, resentment, and something dangerously close to envy. But today, her focus held no admiration at all. The silence stretched between us until it became too pointed to ignore. Sierra finally spoke, her voice tight and controlled, shaped by a frustration she didn't bother to mask. She said she didn't understand what I was doing, that I had thrown the entire household into chaos. She paced as she talked, cutting sharp lines through my living room like she could outrun the reality forming around her. Even without direct accusations, the implication was unmistakable. She believed my hesitation was a betrayal. Watching her, I noticed the tension coiling in her shoulders, the dark circles beginning to bruise the skin beneath her eyes, the way her fingers flexed, as if she were bracing for something she couldn't name. For a moment, I wondered if she had come seeking comfort, if some part of her had hoped the sister who used to fix everything would reappear. But any softness she once carried had been buried beneath layers of expectation and entitlement. As she continued, her tone sharpened. Every sentence circled the same belief: that I owed them stability, that refusing to cover the upcoming expenses was irresponsible, selfish, even dangerous. I let her speak, not out of guilt, but because I needed to hear the full shape of her reasoning. She never mentioned the video. She never acknowledged what I had seen or how deeply it cut. My feelings didn't exist in her version of reality. The only truth she recognized was the one that revolved around their needs. It became clear she hadn't come to understand anything. She had come to correct me. That realization settled over me slowly, not painful but clarifying. Sierra wasn't acting out of fear. She was acting out of certainty, certainty that I would bend, that I would resume the role I had always played, that the dependable sister would appear on cue. But something in me had already shifted, and watching her now only solidified it. Her presence didn't pull me backward, it drew a boundary I hadn't known how to articulate until now. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, not loud, not defensive, simply firm. I told her I had made my decision, that there was nothing left to discuss, and that I needed her to leave. The words didn't waver. They landed cleanly, like a door clicking shut. For a heartbeat, Sierra froze, searching my face for a crack she could pry open. But there was none. She turned sharply, the storm inside her visible in every movement as she walked to the door. When it closed behind her, the silence that followed felt different than before. It wasn't empty. It was steady, grounded. A quiet that belonged solely to me. Early the next evening, a different kind of tension settled over my townhouse, the kind that warns you something is approaching before it announces itself. I had barely finished making dinner when my phone lit up with a call from my dad, Paul, his name glowing across the screen like a warning I already understood. He rarely called directly unless he expected immediate compliance. Letting it ring felt bold, almost unfamiliar, but eventually I answered not out of duty, but because I wanted to hear the version of the narrative he would try to craft. His tone came out sharp and clipped, controlled in the way he used when he intended every word to land like an instruction. He asked what I thought I was doing, why I was making things complicated, why I couldn't simply handle this the way I always had. None of it was new, but the weight beneath his phrasing was unmistakable. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask if anything had happened. He focused solely on the disruption my decision had caused. In the background, I could hear the restless pacing that always echoed through the house when tension rose. It struck me then. He wasn't calling to understand. He was calling to re-establish order. His order. Every word implied he believed my refusal was temporary, an obstacle he could correct with enough pressure. When he finished, I didn't offer explanations or soften anything. I simply told him I wasn't sending the payment. The The silence that followed lasted just long enough for the boundary between us to settle like a wall. Then he let out an irritated exhale, as if my answer confirmed the flaw he'd already assigned me, that I wasn't performing my role correctly. He hung up without another word. Not long after, my mom, Denise, tried. Her voice came wrapped in trembling edges, the familiar pattern she used when she wanted to pull me back into emotional compliance. She spoke about stress, about instability at home, about how difficult everything had become. She didn't mention the video. She didn't consider how it might have broken something in me. She focused only on consequences, not causes. Listening to her felt like slipping underwater. For years, that tone guided my choices, tethering me to their comfort at the expense of my own. But this time, something in me stayed anchored. I didn't apologize. I didn't bend. When the call ended, the quiet left behind felt solid, almost structural. A different task waited. One I had been preparing for since the night I decided I was done carrying the weight of their household. I opened my laptop and pulled up the contact information for Mr. Collins, the landlord who managed the property my parents lived in. I had arranged payments through him for years, handling everything so my parents never had to speak with him directly. Ending that arrangement felt like reclaiming a part of my adulthood I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. When Mr. Collins answered, his tone was brisk and professional, exactly as it had always been. I kept my explanation simple. I told him I would no longer be responsible for the rent, and that future billing needed to go directly to the tenants. He didn't hesitate, didn't question, didn't search for subtext. He simply confirmed the change and made a note to update the account. Real-world consequences rarely carried emotion, they just existed. In a strange way, that neutrality grounded me more than anything else had in weeks. After the call, I logged into my bank and canceled every automatic transfer tied to their expenses. Watching each deletion felt like removing another weight I had once mistaken for part of my spine. My phone buzzed later that night. A single message from my dad, short, final. A declaration that if anything fell apart now, the blame would rest entirely on me. I didn't reply. The stillness that followed wasn't peaceful, but it was honest. Honest in a way I hadn't allowed my life to be in years. And honesty, for the first time, felt like freedom. A few quiet weeks passed before the consequences began to echo back in unmistakable ways. It started with a voicemail from Mr. Collins, his tone steady, but edged with a formality that hinted at complications. When I returned his call, he informed me the tenants were already behind on the first payment they were expected to handle. He mentioned late fees, unsuccessful attempts to reach them, and the urgency of resolving the balance. Nothing in his voice carried judgment. It was simply procedural. But the update didn't stir guilt in me the way it once would have. Ending the arrangement had placed responsibility exactly where it belonged. Instead of tightening my chest, his words settled over me like a reminder of how disproportionate my role in their lives had been. I thanked him, confirmed all future concerns should be directed to the tenants, and ended the call. Later that week, a message from an old neighbor of my parents arrived unexpectedly. We weren't close, just a familiar name tied to childhood summers and borrowed tools. Her note was brief, mentioning tension in the household, voices raised often enough to spill across the yard. She didn't ask me to intervene. She simply assumed I already knew. The assumption stung more than the message itself. It revealed how visible my involvement had been from the outside, how my support had become common knowledge in ways I never intended. Not long after, more fragments of information drifted toward me from different directions. Someone mentioned seeing my dad, Paul, leaving a labor office early one morning, dressed in work clothes he hadn't touched in years. Another hinted that my mom, Denise, had been contacting relatives for small loans, her tone flickering between embarrassment and urgency. And my younger brother, Mason, whose certainty had filled every message he'd ever sent, began posting online about selling his car, alluding to temporary setbacks without naming their source. None of these updates came directly from them. They arrived like loose threads carried by a wind I was no longer expected to follow. For the first time, that distance didn't feel cold. It felt earned. In the space that opened around me, I started noticing how much of my life had been shaped around their needs. How many choices I'd squeezed into narrow corners to make room for the next bill, the next emergency, the next crisis disguised as necessity. Without those demands pressing against me, my days expanded in quiet, unremarkable ways. I cooked more often. I took longer walks after work. I no longer rushed through evenings, bracing for something to fall apart. Financially, the shift was even clearer. Money that used to evaporate as soon as it touched my account now stayed long enough for me to breathe. I paid down debts. I started a savings fund I had attempted and failed to build for years. The relief wasn't explosive. It was steady, measured, like air slowly returning to a room sealed too long. A part of me wondered how they were processing the change, not with longing or regret, just a detached curiosity about what it meant for them to face responsibilities they had handed to me so casually. I didn't wish hardship on them. I wished clarity. I wished accountability. And whether they wanted it or not, both had arrived. By the end of the month, the noise from their world faded into background static, distant, faint, and no longer tethered to me. For years, I had been the buffer between their choices and the consequences waiting behind them. Without me there, the consequences finally stepped forward, and I was learning, slowly, what my life looked like without carrying anyone else's weight. By the time the month drew to a close, the distance between my life and theirs had widened into something unmistakably solid. I wasn't checking for updates anymore, yet they still found ways to reach me indirectly, like signals from a world I no longer lived in. One of those signals arrived through an unfamiliar number late one night, a notification containing a single video attachment. Curiosity nudged me more than concern, so I opened it. The footage was shaky, as if someone had filmed it while pretending not to. It showed the living room of my parents' house, lit by a single overhead lamp that cast uneven shadows across old carpet and cluttered tables. My dad, Paul, paced in clipped, rigid lines, his posture wound tight. My mom, Denise, sat on the couch, wringing her hands with an agitation that made her look older than she had just a month earlier. Sierra hovered near the hallway, arms crossed, her expression sharp with frustration. They weren't talking about me. They were talking about each other. Accusations snapped through the room in fractured bursts. Paul blamed Denise for not budgeting. Denise blamed Mason for unreliable income. Sierra insisted none of this would have escalated if someone else had stepped in the way I used to. Their voices collided, overlapping into the familiar chaos I had once been expected to absorb and mend. Now, without anyone to steady the imbalance, the tension finally had room to spill into the open. No one mentioned the video they accidentally sent me weeks earlier. No one acknowledged the names they'd called me. They only spoke about the absence, about the space my support used to fill. Watching them unravel didn't bring satisfaction. It brought clarity. They weren't falling apart because I stepped away. They were falling apart because they had never learned to stand on their own. When the video ended, I felt the weight of a decision I had postponed long enough. It was time to draw a final line. I sat at my desk, opened a blank email, and began typing not out of anger but necessity. I explained that I understood the dynamic shaping our lives for years. I didn't list payments, I didn't revisit insults, I didn't demand accountability. I simply stated that I was stepping out of the role I had never agreed to, that I would no longer be a buffer between them and the consequences of their choices. I asked them not to contact me again unless it was for something meaningful, something human. Pressing send felt steady, not sharp. Blocking their numbers felt like protection, something I should have granted myself long ago. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was spacious. In the weeks that followed, I reflected on everything I had survived. Stepping away hadn't made me heartless. It had made me truthful. And truth, I learned, is a kind of freedom. If my story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part spoke to you the most? Tell me in the comments and let others know they're not alone. Your support means more than you realize, and your perspective might help someone else find the courage I finally found.